Good morning. If you'll open in your Old Testaments with me to 1 Samuel chapter 25. 1 Samuel chapter 25. As you're turning there, a few kids were asked about love and marriage. And one 8-year-old boy said, "Girls just search out for love, and I've been hiding from them, and unfortunately they keep on finding me." A second one said, "Before I think about marriage, I want to graduate kindergarten, then we can get to all that." And my personal favorite was one kid describing love said, "Love is when you tell your wife she's pretty, even when she looks like a truck." That would be something that would be pretty foolish if an adult said that. And some men and women are such fools. But in the scriptures, we learned about a marriage where at least one person was borderline perfect from the point of view of scripture. I'm sure she didn't carry that out forever. But if you look at 1 Samuel chapter 25, we learn about a husband and a wife. And there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. He was a Calebite. Now, most of the older translations aren't usually held by anyone anymore, but Nabal literally means fool. And I don't know what he did to his mama to get that name, but this guy's name is literally fool. And the scripture cements that he is a fool by saying at the end of verse 3, he was harsh and badly behaved. Now, the point of this lesson is not to identify who among us is a fool, who is married to a fool, who is Abigail, and who is Nabal. Y'all can do that over lunch. That's a perfectly good lunch conversation, safely away from me and any fault I would have in that. But as we think about this, you have a marriage of someone who is described as beautiful and discerning. That is, she looked good and she thought well. And he is described as a fool who is harsh and badly behaved. Can you see this? We might call this an unequally yoked marriage. Now, our point this morning is not to say, okay, who do we find to marry? Who do I look for? What is love? It is simply, what do we do when we are a fool to stop being one? Or when we're interacting with someone who is, because Abigail drew the unfortunate hand of having to interact with this fool, Nabal, day after day after day. And by the way, just one more time to be clear, I'm not just calling him a fool because it sounds good. That is literally what his name means. Older translations will just render his name fool. The name of the man was fool, and the name of his wife, Abigail. So as we look at this story, again, we're going to look at how to not be like Nabal and how to be more like Abigail, but then a third person pops in, one that's a little bit more familiar to us in verse 4. David, this is the David you know of, later to be King David. David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So David sent 10 young men, and David said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel and go up to Nabal, greet him in my name. Then you shall greet him, peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have. I hear that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm, and they missed nothing all the time they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have at hand to your servants and to your son David." When David's young men came, they said all this to Nabal in the name of David, and they waited. And Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shears and give it to men who come from I do not know where?" So David's young men turned away and came and told him all this. And David said to his men, "Every man strap on his sword." Every man of them strapped on his sword. David also strapped on his sword, and about 400 men went up after David, while 200 remained with the baggage. But one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, "Behold, David sent messengers out of the wilderness to greet our master, and he railed at them. Yet the men were very good to us, and we suffered no harm, and we did not miss anything when we were in the fields as long as we went with them. They were a wall to us both by night and by day, all the while we were with them keeping the sheep. Now therefore know this and consider what you should do, for harm is determined against our master and against all his house, and he is such a worthless man that one cannot speak to him." And while we know of David as king, you can see that even without being at the, quote, height of his power, David has a father. But in short, let's summarize the story as follows. A fool is married to Abigail, and the fool does what? Can you guess? He acts foolishly. But what's behind his foolishness? David asked for something from him, and notice his response again in verse 11. "Shall I take my bread, my water, my meat that I have killed for my shears and give it to men who come from I do not know where?" That's 6 I's or my's in one verse, and that's bad by any standard. Nabal selfishly rejects David. Now in that interaction in verse 14 through 17, where the messengers, the servants, come and reason with Abigail saying, you've got to help us. Notice what they say is, look, David and his men have helped us. They've done their job, and David is asking for, you might call it, some help in return. And Nabal doesn't just say no. He says no in an incredibly selfish, arrogant way. And that's not a surprise, because going back to verse 3, how is he described by the text? Harsh and badly behaved. So as we continue in the story, we see that Abigail is told to intervene. Notice that the servants, by the way, we're not going to camp out on this point today, but just as we're reading, notice that Abigail has such a reputation with the family, with the household and the servants, that they think, okay, Nabal's being Nabal again. Who can fix it? Abigail can. And so that would be a good thought to us. One way to not be like Nabal is to make sure we are like Abigail. Be someone that people can trust to get things done and in a wise way. So Abigail is not just walking into a Nabal problem, though. What was David's reaction? Go back in the text before we move forward. In verse 12, David's young men turned away and came back and told him all this. So Nabal says, nope, I'm not going to help. Who are you to me? And David says, okay, what am I going to do? We're going to kill you all. We are going to burn you to the ground. So keep in mind, Abigail is not just facing Nabal, who is fool. She's dealing with King David, who is currently acting like a fool. Just because you're offended or bothered by something doesn't mean, I know this is a newsflash, you can go and burn down the town. Now we can argue that maybe David was within some sort of rights. Here's the bottom line that the text is going to get to at the end of chapter 25. Murder because you didn't get your way is not okay in the eyes of God. Hopefully that's not a contentious point for us, but just note that Abigail is between a rock and a hard place. So let's learn from how does she approach this, knowing either side she goes to make peace is very upset. Nabal and his arrogance, David and his pride at being turned down. In verse 18, Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves and 2 skins of wine and 5 sheep already prepared, 5 sides of parched grain and 100 clusters of raisins and 200 cakes of figs, and laid them on donkeys. But she said to her young men, go on before me. Behold, I come after you. But she did not tell her husband Nabal. As she rode on the donkey and came down into the cover of the mountain, behold, David and his men came down toward her, and she met them. Now David had said, surely in vain have I guarded all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him. And he has returned me evil for good. God do so to the enemies of David, and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him. We're going to stop the reading for a moment. Anytime you see someone talking about themselves in third person, they have an ego problem. Can we see that in verse 22? God do so to the enemies of David. That is David. The older translations, if you have a note, by the way, the translation says to David. So that's not a loophole. I'm not making a mountain out of a molehill. David says, God's going to get the enemies of David. That's usually a problem. And this is the person Abigail is coming to. Now, if you notice what she does, first of all, in verse 18, Abigail didn't just go. What does the text say? Abigail made haste. Now, we spoke in the Bible class about conflict, and regardless of whether you were in here or not, just know, when there is a problem, what is the best way to handle it? Yes with love, yes with gentleness, yes with grace, all those $1 million Bible class words. Absolutely. But that word haste is important. Abigail doesn't wait for the killing to begin, for David to completely lose his temper. She goes immediately to fix the problem. I wonder, it's just a thought, how many problems could be solved? How many big issues in families, in churches, in communities would be solved if there was immediate action rather than letting it sit and fester and spread and wait? Abigail realizes she needs to make haste. Now, what else does she do? She brings with her an offering for David. And one interesting note in verse 19, she's smart enough to do what? Leave Nabal at home. Don't bring the fool. Again, another reason not to be the fool. But in verse 20 and 21, she comes down to David, and David is furious. Is this Abigail's fault? No, not at all. Now, that's going to be interesting, because number one, David seems really mad at her, the messenger of Nabal, albeit unappointed by him. So how does Abigail respond when her husband has put her in a no-win, and David, who is about to kill everyone, is furious and venting it at her, knowing she's completely blameless? Let's see this interestingly in verse 23. When Abigail saw David, she hurried and got down from the donkey and fell before David on her face and bowed to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, on me alone, my Lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant. Let not my Lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my Lord, whom you sent. Now then, my Lord, as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand, now then let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my Lord be as Nabal. And now let this present that your servant has brought to my Lord be given to the young men who follow my Lord. Please forgive the trespass of your servant. For the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, that evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. If men rise up to pursue you and to seek your life, the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living in the care of the Lord your God. And the lives of your enemies he shall sling out as from the hollow of a sling. And when the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you and has appointed you prince over Israel, my Lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, or for my Lord working salvation himself. And when the Lord has dwelt well with my Lord, then remember your servant. She does a lot of really good things here. To be the opposite of a fool, she acts wisely. She acts with great discernment, as the text has already highlighted. Notice how Abigail reasons with David. A few different steps. First of all, she's already made haste in verse 18. She's brought an offering. And by the way, the offering wasn't a bribe. Sometimes this is read as if this is a bribe. What was David asking for in the first place? Nabal to do what? Help take care of some of his men. What does Abigail bring? Food for who? Some of his men. Verse 27, let this present that your servant has brought to my Lord be given to the young men who follow my Lord. So she understands the problem, which means she listened and she has taken it in. But not only does she have haste, in verse 23, when she gets there, the very first physical action she takes, aside from literally getting off the donkey, is to what? Fall on her face before David and bow to the ground. Now that's just not just a physical action. In the next verse, she says, this is my fault, David. I'm going to take the wrong. That's pretty amazing for two reasons. Number one, she has literally nothing to do with this. She's the only person acting even sort of rationally in this moment. David, albeit who was wrong, is about to commit his own wrong. Nabal is, as always, fool. And Abigail's the one person doing things wisely and well, and she says, put it on me. Second reason that's amazing is when we are innocent, what is the first thing we want to do? Hey, don't yell at me. I'm just the messenger. This is not my fault. Calm yourself. David, two wrongs don't make a right, man. Calm yourself. Abigail doesn't focus on that. And by the way, she doesn't just take the blame. Notice she actually is very clever in how she reasons. She says, first of all, in 24, on me alone be the guilt. But then notice what she also says in verse 26. Now then, my Lord, as the Lord lives, as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand, now then, let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my Lord be as Nabal. What does she say? She says, David, I want to make sure you know what's important. I know who you are. You know who you are. You know who the Lord is. You know who Nabal is. We are agreed. Nabal's a fool. You should be better than this. But in verse 25, the last phrase, I, your servant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent. Do you see what she actually sandwiched in there as she's handling this very difficult, hot-headed man? First thing, she humbles herself and takes the blame. She ends by talking about how important it is that David submit to the Lord and all the good that the Lord would do for David if he does. But in the middle, she points out the very thing we all knew from the beginning. This is not her fault. Did you notice that? Part of her reasoning with David actually goes back to what she already said. Why? Because sometimes you have to communicate with someone to get them down a few notches before you can have a reasonable conversation. Too often people try to fight emotion with logic, and someone is so upset that they're not going to hear logic, or the reverse, depending on how people think. Abigail is very smooth in how she reasons with David. And of course, here's how the story ends the way you think a biblical narrative would. The wise lives and the fool dies. Verse 32, David said to Abigail, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from working salvation with my own hand. For surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, who has restrained me from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come to meet me, truly by morning there had not been left to Nabal so much as one man. Then David received from her hand what she had brought him. He said to her, go up in peace to your house. See, I have obeyed your voice. I have granted your petition. And Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, he was holding a feast in his house like the feast of a king. And Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunk. So he told him nothing at all until the morning light. And in the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him these things. And his heart died within him and became as a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, blessed be the Lord who has avenged the insult I received at the hand of Nabal, and has kept back his servant from wrongdoing. The Lord has returned the evil of Nabal on his own head. Then David sent and spoke to Abigail to take her as his wife. It's interesting to see a couple things that we're not going to focus on this morning. Number one, when Abigail dealt wisely, shrewdly, with humility and kindness and gentleness, it works. And beyond the fact that it works, who was paying attention to the wrong going on the entire time? God. Abigail tells David this. You can't just work salvation yourself. You can't just go kill people because he wronged you. And what does David realize at the end of this? In verse 39, I'm glad I held back because who has taken care of this? The Lord has returned the evil of Nabal on his own head. One reason that wise people act foolishly, one reason we become fools is we try to bring justice of our own making. And that is a huge problem. That belongs to who and who alone? The Lord, the God, the Creator. And that's good. And that's good not only because I'm imperfect, it's good because I need to know when I'm struggling, when I'm tempted to be like a fool, which we're going to end our lesson on in just a moment. I need to remember God's got this. God doesn't need my help understanding the situation. He has understood it. If he can make all of us, if he can understand all of our thoughts, if he knows everything about us, he is aware of who is wrong too and what the problem is. So we need to trust him to take care of it. So we're going to end the lesson on 5 ideas of how I can be less like a fool and more wise and pleasing to God, like Jesus was and like we're supposed to be. First, we'll learn from the fools. Number 1, don't be one. Don't be a fool. And why is Nabal particularly foolish? Verse 3, yes, he was harsh and badly behaved. But if you notice it came out in the reading, didn't it? You see that in verse 11. I take my bread, my water, my meat that I have killed for my shears to give it to men who come from I do not know where. Nabal is the king and making it all about himself. And not only is this sinful, this is an incredibly huge problem. We overuse the word toxic. I would have said that otherwise, but everyone decides what toxic means, so it's a worthless word now. But it is a problem to everyone who is around them. You know, that's a weird, clunky way of saying it is a toxic problem when you are selfish. And nothing magnifies that in our culture more than social media, right? Because social media, you log on, what did it used to say? I don't know if it still does or not, but what do you think? What do you want to share? And I'm just going to be honest, I love low-resolution pictures of your dinner as much as anyone could. But maybe I don't quite need to know everything, right? And I'm not mad about food posts. That's a grumpy old man thing. That's not my problem. I'm pointing out that we are trained and conditioned with everything we take in and that we put out that what matters the most in this world. Not just me, but how I feel and how I think. And that is how you breed a generation of and an individual who is a fool. Nabal has great riches. He's successful by worldly standards. He has a beautiful and discerning wife. Nabal lacks nothing. And by the way, if he would have helped David's men, that would essentially cost him nothing. Not truly nothing, but to a man of his wealth, this was more about his pride and ego. Nabal's not just willing to go down on a sword, he's willing to swing it as hard as he can, as he goes down to make sure David is put in his place. I, Nabal, don't have to help you. Selfishness is the cause of foolishness. We need to spend far less time thinking about how we think and feel and focusing more on what God has said and how God sees people. Because I'll tell you what makes a difference, because when I spend my time, I think, what do I want to watch tonight? What do I want to listen to? What do I want to go do? And that's very different than God, who is watching and whose heart is breaking with compassion and love for someone in my community who is struggling at the moment and who needs a friend, who needs someone to call, who needs someone to bring a meal, who needs someone to go and visit, to sit with them, to talk with them, to maybe even work extra to take money not for something fun, but for something to help them have necessities. You see, there's a huge difference in the way God looks at time availability in life and the way we do. And it really comes down to one word: being a steward. There was a preacher named Kevin Clark who is the best illustration on this ever. He said when he would go into a meetings place, sometimes he would rent a car, but one congregation changed it on him, and they let him borrow a nice car of one of the members. And he said that was incredibly nice, and I really didn't like it. He said, because I have never driven that car more like my grandmother than any car I've driven in my life. Why? Why would you take someone's really nice car and drive it like a grandma when if you rented a car, you'd probably drive the wheels off of it? Because it's not mine. It doesn't belong to me. And unless you're a fool, you're not caught up with what belongs to you. You're aware this isn't going to me. It's not my property. It's somebody else's. And what do? We tend to value that higher. We need to realize we are stewards of God's. Everything we do, the way we live, the way we talk, the way we think, how we spend our time and our resources, this is a reflection of what I am paying back God for what he has done for me. If God made me and Jesus died for me, I belong to him. He's not just king, he's my loving Lord. And that means I need to not be selfish and a fool. In Matthew chapter 6, look with me there. We're going to look at some of 1 Samuel 25 and then look into the New Testament, see application as we study our Bibles here. Matthew chapter 6, in verse 1, beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Thus when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward, but when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Number one, Jesus is saying don't be hypocritical. Number two, you don't do good things to be seen. That's a selfish motivation. And what's powerful about this is that Jesus teaches selfishness can ruin otherwise selfless actions. Isn't that kind of alarming? I can do good things for the wrong reason. What does that gain me? Well, maybe an earthly reward, but nothing when it comes to pleasing my actual Lord. This life is not about me. I need to make it about others. I need to remember what we talked about, joy, Jesus, others, yourself. Now, another thing we learned from David, who is acting foolishly at the beginning, is the common phrase, everyone's grandma taught him, 2 wrongs don't make a right. Now, you think about this, by the way, 2 wrongs don't make a right. When you watch college football, it happens every Saturday. You just hope it's not your team. 2 guys start fighting, and there's a punch, somebody gets knocked down, and then some fool comes in and jumps on him or hits him while he's down, and guess who gets the flag, right? It is always the last guy. And you're watching it, and when it's not your team, you're thinking, that's not fair. They were both going back and forth. But we all know, we've all heard it, every coach has said it, every parent shouting at their television has said it, the last guy always gets caught. And here's the bottom line about that. It doesn't matter if it was provoked or not because he's guilty. If David had worked his own salvation, to use Abigail's language, if he had killed those people because he was mad, whether he was quote-unquote entitled to it or not, whether he was wronged or not, that didn't matter. When you sin, it's your fault. It doesn't matter what someone else did. And I think this is one of the ways that Satan gets us. One of the reasons that the world is so foolish is because everyone always has a reason for why they do what they do. There's always a reason. Well, this is their fault because of this. And this is my fault because of this. And no one is better at getting fault placed off of them than our people in Washington, D.C., right? Everything is always someone else's fault. It can't be theirs. Sometimes we've reached a new low. It's someone else in my side's problem. It used to just be side pointing. Now we're internally pointing. But it's not me. I didn't do it. Now, I'm not going to help you fix it, but it's not my fault. Now, if David had lived on that principle, not only would Nabal and all the males that died and been slaughtered, innocent people would have gone down. Would that have been right for David? Absolutely not. 2 reasons we know that. Number 1, shocker, murder is wrong. Taking innocent life is wrong. But the second thing, Abigail even layers it when she's calmly reasoning with David while he is furious. She says, look, if you will hold back, if you let the Lord take care of it, not only will he take care of it, he's going to take care of you. And he's going to take care of you when your enemies come for you. By the way, that's a really prescient point for David, who is being chased by Saul. He would value that. I need to remember that one thing a fool does is explain away actions. Well, I only did this because they. I only did this because he. That's not what we're called to do. Look at Matthew 5, 38 through 42. Jesus destroys this head on. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. Jesus literally says, if someone seeks to hit you, and does, they wants to sue you and take what is yours, and does, and forces you, the English Standard Version says in verse 41, to go a mile. And I've seen some of y'all talk about marathons. This would be a painful punishment. You're supposed to do what? Go the extra mile. Give them your other cloak. Turn the other cheek. Jesus doesn't just say 2 wrongs don't make a right. He says your job is to do what's right, period. It doesn't matter if they're wrong. And by the way, what do we learn from 1 Samuel 25? God is aware this happens. Jesus knows people are going to do wrong. He's not defending the wrongdoing. He's telling the people who are going to listen to him that God values and God made and who care about God as Lord and King, you do the right thing. You be the one. It doesn't matter what everyone else is doing. It doesn't matter what's fair or unfair. It doesn't matter who's coming out for you. You be like Jesus. And that will keep us from being like a fool. 3 points from Abigail, and the lesson will be yours. Number 1, Jesus calls for peacemakers like her. A wonderful case study could be made from 1 Samuel 25, 14 through 25. How does Abigail approach someone who is furious? Not just someone who has been wronged and is mad. Not just having an annoying fool of a husband. But someone who is going to have to go in between them while the tensions are high and emotions are running hot. And the way she had humility, and the way she reasoned with him, the way she sandwiched in points, the way she kept her focus on God, all are fantastic examples we'll look at in a moment. But the fact that she inserted herself at all is what Jesus calls us directly to. Look in Matthew 5, verse 2. He opened his mouth and taught them, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Jesus again, in verses 9 through 12 in particular, calls out, look, people are going to mistreat you. That is life. If you think you're going to get through life without someone causing a problem in your life, good luck. You haven't stepped outside. Interact with people. You will have people problems. Here's a side note, by the way. The people who know you also have people problems. Sometimes it can even be us who are the problem. I know that never happens internally, but externally someone probably is thinking. But Jesus doesn't just say to be poor in spirit, to hunger and thirst for righteousness, to be merciful, all these wonderful traits. He says in verse 9 to be a peacemaker. And while we talked about this for our leaders last week, the leaders of God's church are supposed to be shepherds, elders. One of the things they need to do is not just be peaceful. This is often read as be someone who is at peace with people. Paul would say in Romans 12, as far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all men. That's not what Jesus is saying here. That's true. Not what Jesus is saying here. What is he saying? Peacemakers gets in between the fool and the hothead and brokers peace. That's uncomfortable for a couple reasons. Number 1, Abigail took the blame. Sometimes when I'm at fault, I don't even take the blame that is mine, let alone take somebody else's like she did willingly. Number 2, when you're in between a rock and a hard place, what happens? You're going to get squished. It's dangerous. It's concerning. You don't want to do that. But it doesn't really matter what I want, does it? Because that's what Nabal does. The fool cares about what they want, what they feel, what's easy, what their rights are, what belongs to them. Jesus says, I want you to be the peacemaker. I want you to get in between the rock and the hard place. I want you to help others. And the only way you can do that is if you have a heart that cares. What was Abigail motivated by? She didn't care about Nabal. She left him out of the discussion. She seems happy that he died. We're not going to talk about that, but even though it seems pretty understandable. But she is spoken to by who? The servants of the household. They respected her. They knew her. And they knew she could help. She could help. Why? Because she cared. She cared apparently for David's soul, or at least she made a convenient argument out of it. And she certainly cared for those of her household. We need to care proactively for others. And if we don't, that makes me way more like Nabal and not nearly enough like Jesus or Abigail. Secondly, we need to be a humble example. Obviously, Abigail did this physically. She did this in her rhetoric. But look in John chapter 13. Notice what Jesus does. Again, another passage we talked about when it comes to having problems in the Bible class. In John 13, in verse 1, now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of the world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. He poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. And came to him, Simon Peter said to him, Lord, do you wash my feet? Jesus answered him, what I'm doing you do not understand now, but afterwards you will understand. So Peter said to him, you shall never wash my feet. And Jesus answered him, if I do not wash you, you have no share with me. So Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. Jesus said, the one who has bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you. For he knew who was to betray him. That was why he said, not all of you are clean. When he goes to explain why did Jesus get down and wash the disciples' feet, including Judas, who's called out in verse 2, and also again in verse 10 and 11, notice his explanation in verse 13. You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If then I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should also do just as I have done to you. Let's talk about this. Jesus, master and Lord, master and teacher. If I got down and washed your feet, what do you have to do? You got to wash others' feet. Here's part of the problem. Two problems. Number one, we often who are down here think we're here and other people are here. Bad news for you. First of all, that's not right. Second of all, even if that was true, what does Jesus say to do? If I, your Lord and teacher, do it, what do you have to do? Go and do likewise as the servant. So even if I was above people, I'm not. That's wrong. I need to have humility. My example is to what? Serve everyone, including those below me. Again, there is no one below me. We're all made in the image of God. We need to think that way. But too often we're caught up like my little niece. I think I've shared the story before. My niece, before we went Christmas light looking at something my family always does on Christmas Eve, we go out and look at all the lights in the neighborhood. She was 2 years old, has the strongest will I have ever seen in my life. And she was told that she needed to say sorry for hitting her older brother. And she said, no sorry. And so my sister said, okay, guess we're going to do this. We're going to wait. And she said, you need to say sorry. Whacked her. No sorry. Tears flowing. You need to say sorry. No sorry. 6, 7, 8 times for literally over 10 minutes. That was by the time I started tracking it, how long we were going to wait, which was fine. It was kind of funny to watch in another room. Finally, this kid who didn't just not apologize, actively through tears and pain was saying, no sorry, said, sorry, and moved on. Now here's the thing. That's funny in a 2-year-old. It's not very appealing in people who are adults. It's cute that we're training her and that she has a strong will, and if it's trained right, she's going to be awesome, because good luck moving that. But there's people like that, and we are called to be the opposite. Abigail was at no fault, and she didn't just make haste. She made haste, got off, physically bowed before David, and verbally said, put it on me. That is humility. That is laying down herself to help others. She was a peacemaker. She was a shield, and she was an effective one because not only was she peaceful, but she was humble. She was willing to say, no one else can do this, I need to go. And even if someone else could, I am here, I have the ability, I'm going to go. But we have to look at others that way. We can't look at others like Peter and say, Lord, you can't do this to me. We have different standards for the Lord and me than me and other people. I have to love like Jesus loved. If Jesus can wash Judas's feet, if Abigail can take the fault that wasn't hers, I can serve others with humility. I need to remember that. And finally, here's the bottom line. I need to not be distracted by fools. There is something that always bothers me when we're driving. There's a lot of things bothering me when we're driving. But one of them is there is a pileup, and I look on the maps, and it turns yellow and then red. And I'm thinking, okay, either something really bad happened, and I'm very sorry, or someone's just driving like Nabal. And as I'm driving, I think, I feel really bad right now. Someone's going to be in a serious accident, and I'm very upset by this. And I convince myself to not be worried about it and to pray for somebody. And then I pull up and I realize we were all going 10 miles under because there was an empty police car on the side of the road. And I think, Nabal got me again. Very frustrated by the fact that people drive foolishly. And all the while, I've spent a minute and a half staring at my yellow and red phone, thinking about things that don't matter, vacillating between happy and sad, frustrated and wondering if I'm going to be right or wrong. And not only should I be worried about if there actually was an accident, not only should I have time to pray, I should be thankful and just enjoy where I am. If it is nothing, be thankful it's nothing, and be thankful that there are roads to drive on, that even if there are Nabals around me, that I can drive on and get to where I'm going. There are so many more important things to focus on than people doing wrong and people being foolish. Here's a news flash. There are Nabals among us. Number one, don't be him. But number two, don't be distracted by them. You focus on God. You focus on doing what's right. You do what you need to do, and God will settle the score. God has got this. He has the vision. He has the knowledge. He has the execution. God is aware of who is his and who is not. So I need to make sure I'm with him. Let's close on Matthew chapter 10, and then the lesson will be yours. Matthew chapter 10, in verse 28. Jesus says very clearly in Matthew 10:28, and do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Not 2 sparrows sold for a penny, and not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. But even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, therefore, you are of more value than many sparrows. So everyone who acknowledges me before men, I also will acknowledge before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I also will deny before my Father who is in heaven. And we should read that and have two ideas. One is, whew, that's scary. And number two, wow, that is awesome that Jesus will advocate for you. Isn't that amazing? If I understand who God is, if I submit to him, Jesus will be my advocate. He will confess me before the Father. That is miraculous that Jesus cares for me that way and that he knows me. So what does it mean to be a child of God? I need to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. I need to confess him as Lord. That means when he says something, I do it, not because it feels good or it seems good, but because his will matters more than mine. I'm a steward of his time and of this body. I owe him my everything. I'm going to repent of my sins because too often I've been like Nabal, I've been like David. I've let the emotions of the day and my selfish will tell me what to do when it's supposed to be the Lord. I need to stop that. I need to change. I need to be baptized. The only way to connect with the sacrifice of Jesus and the blood that he shed is to connect to the cross. And how do we do that? In Romans chapter 6, 1 through 5, we are buried in baptism. We have put to death the old man of sin like Jesus was crucified, and then we are raised out of water to newness of life just as Jesus was resurrected from the dead. And in so doing, we've put to death the man of sin and are now a clean disciple of Jesus Christ. Isn't that amazing that God allows that for us? Maybe you're someone like David, you know who God is, you're a Christian, and you struggle because there are fools around, and it's hard to keep your patience when Nabal's around every single corner. But know that God cares for you too. He will forgive you if you